She was a queen. She had a crown. She had a palace. She had servants. She had power. But behind all of that, there was a woman who spent much of her life surrounded by loss. Her name was Anne. She was born in 1665. She was the daughter of James, Duke of York, the future King James II. And Anne was born into one of the most powerful royal families in Britain. From the beginning, her life was shaped by royal expectations. She was not free to choose an ordinary life. Every friendship mattered. Every marriage mattered. Every decision could affect the future of the crown. Anne grew up with her older sister Mary. The two sisters were very different. Mary was confident. Anne was quieter and more reserved. But despite their differences, the sisters were connected by their royal upbringing. Their father later became King James II. But his reign created deep political and religious divisions in Britain. James was Catholic. Many powerful people feared that Britain would remain under Catholic rule. And eventually, the country turned against him. In 1688, the Glorious Revolution changed everything. Anne's sister Mary and her husband William were invited to take the throne. James II fled Britain, and Mary became Queen Mary II, and suddenly found herself living in the shadow of her older sister. But Anne's personal life was already becoming complicated. She had married Prince George of Denmark. Their marriage was arranged within the world of European royalty. But over time, Anne developed a genuine affection for her husband. Prince George was not a powerful political figure. He was often criticized for being quiet and unambitious. But Anne loved him. And for a woman whose life was controlled by royal duty, that love became one of the most important parts of her world. Then Anne became a mother. And for a short time, she believed she might finally have the family she had always wanted. But tragedy came again and again. Anne became pregnant many times. She gave birth to children. She hoped they would survive. She hoped one of them would grow up to become the future of her family. But most of her children died very young. Some lived only for days. Others survived for months. And each loss left another wound. Imagine being a mother, holding your newborn child, dreaming about their future, and then having to bury them. And experienced this pain repeatedly. Yet she was expected to continue. She was a princess, a member of the royal family. And one day, she might become queen. Her grief could not stop the machinery of monarchy. She still had to appear in public, still had to attend ceremonies, still had to behave as royalty demanded, behind the royal doors. However, Anne was suffering. Her health also began to deteriorate. She struggled with severe physical problems. And as the years passed, she became increasingly dependent on those closest to her. One of the most important people in her life was Sarah Churchill. Sarah was intelligent, strong, ambitious, and extremely close to Anne. Their friendship became unusually powerful. Sarah could speak to Anne in a way that few others could. She advised her, comforted her, and sometimes even challenged her. For Anne, Sarah was more than a courtier. She was a trusted friend. But relationships built around power can become dangerous, especially when one person is queen, and the other person has enormous influence over her. For now, Anne still had her husband. She still had Sarah. And she still had hope that one of her children might survive. But history was moving toward another great change. Her sister Mary would soon die. The throne would eventually pass to Anne. And the quiet princess who had spent so much of her life in the shadow of others would suddenly become Queen of England, Scotland, and Ireland. But when the crown finally came to her, Anne would discover that becoming queen did not mean her suffering was over. It was only the beginning of the hardest chapter of her life, and had spent much of her life surrounded by loss. But there was still one part of her life that gave her comfort. Her husband, Prince George. Anne and George were deeply attached to each other. Their marriage was not remembered as a great political romance. It was something quieter, something more personal. George stayed close to, and while she experienced repeated pregnancies and repeated tragedies, and wanted children desperately. She wanted to build a family. She wanted to leave behind an heir. But pregnancy after pregnancy ended in heartbreak. Some of her children were born too early. Others became sick and died, and suffered miscarriage after miscarriage. And every loss became another painful memory. Yet she continued trying, because the future of the monarchy depended upon an heir. Then one child gave an hope. Prince William, the Duke of Gloucester. He survived longer than his brothers and sisters, and loved him deeply. For a mother who had already lost so many children, William seemed like a miracle. He was growing. He was healthy. And everyone hoped he might one day become king, and began to believe that perhaps her family would finally have a future. But that hope would not last. In 1700, Prince William became seriously ill. He was only 11 years old. Doctors could do very little, and watched helplessly as her son became weaker. The child who had represented her greatest hope was dying. And then, he was gone, and was devastated. She had lost another child. But this time, the loss was different. William had been old enough for her to know his personality. She had watched him grow. She had imagined his future. And now that future had disappeared. Anne's health became worse. Her grief became deeper. And the question of succession became a major political crisis. Who would inherit the crown after Anne? The future of Britain was uncertain. Meanwhile, Anne's sister Mary had already died, and King William III was growing older. When William died in 1702, and finally became queen, she was 37 years old. The woman who had spent her life watching other people wear the crown was now wearing it herself. But there was something painfully ironic about her victory. She had finally reached the throne. Yet she had almost no surviving children. She had the crown, but she had lost the family she had dreamed of. Her coronation was magnificent. Thousands gathered. Church bells rang. Royal ceremonies filled the streets. Anne was officially queen. But behind the celebration, she carried years of grief. She also carried another burden. War. Europe was entering a major conflict. Britain became involved in the War of the Spanish Succession. Anne's reign became closely connected with military campaigns. Her government needed victories. Her country needed stability. And the Queen was expected to show strength. And did something unusual for a monarch of her time. She took a personal interest in the war. She visited troops. She met soldiers. And she wanted to understand what was happening on the battlefield. But even while Britain was fighting abroad, Anne's personal world was becoming increasingly complicated. Her closest friend Sarah Churchill had enormous influence over her. Sarah was powerful. She had connections. She had ambition. And she had strong political opinions. Anne trusted Sarah. Sometimes perhaps too much. Sarah believed she knew what was best for the Queen. But Anne was beginning to change. She was no longer simply the quiet princess Sarah had known. She was queen. And she was starting to realize that being queen meant making her own decisions. The relationship between the two women slowly became strained. Sarah wanted influence. And wanted peace. Sarah wanted to be heard. And wanted loyalty. And soon, their friendship would become one of the most painful relationships of Anne's life. But before that happened, another woman entered the Queen's world. Abigail Marsham. She was very different from Sarah. Quiet, gentle, and much less demanding, and found comfort in her company. At first, Sarah did not believe Abigail could become a serious rival. But she was wrong. Because slowly, Abigail became closer to the Queen, and Sarah began losing the influence she had once taken for granted. The friendship that had survived years of royal pressure was beginning to break, and Anne was caught between two women, one who had known her for years, and another who offered her a different kind of comfort. The queen, who had lost so many people she loved, was about to lose another relationship. And this time, the pain would come from someone who had once been her closest friend. Queen and had finally reached the throne. But becoming queen did not bring her the peace she had hoped for. Her life was still filled with pressure. Britain was at war. Her health was fragile. And the future of the monarchy remained uncertain. But the greatest problem inside the palace was becoming personal. Sarah Churchill, the woman who had been Anne's closest friend, was slowly losing her influence. For years, Sarah had been one of the most powerful people around the Queen. She could speak openly to Anne. She could advise her. She could disagree with her. And Anne had trusted her completely. But Sarah had a strong personality. She was ambitious. She was outspoken. And she often believed that her opinion should be followed. Anne was changing. She was becoming more confident as queen. And she no longer wanted someone else making every decision for her. Then Abigail Marsham became increasingly close to Anne. Abigail was quiet, gentle, and unlike Sarah, she rarely demanded anything from the Queen, and found comfort in her presence. For a woman who had experienced so much grief, that simple kindness meant a great deal. Sarah became suspicious. She could see that Abigail was becoming important to Anne, and she was not willing to give up her position easily. The friendship between Anne and Sarah began to deteriorate. Arguments became more frequent. Anne became frustrated. Sarah became angry. And the woman who had once been Anne's closest companion was slowly becoming one of the greatest sources of stress in her life. But while this personal struggle was happening, Anne was also facing enormous political pressure. The war in Europe continued. British soldiers were fighting far from home. The government needed money. The country needed victories. And Anne had to work with powerful ministers who did not always agree with each other. Yet one military victory changed the reputation of her reign. In 1704, British and Allied forces won the Battle of Blenheim. It was a major victory against France and its allies. The victory became a symbol of British strength. Anne was proud. And Britain celebrated. But the Queen understood that victory came with a price. Thousands of soldiers had died. Families had lost fathers and sons. The country celebrated. But Anne knew what war really meant. She had already experienced enough personal loss to understand grief. Now she was responsible for a nation at war. She visited wounded soldiers. She supported military causes. And she tried to present herself as a strong monarch. But behind the public image, her health continued to suffer, and experienced severe pain. She had difficulty walking. Her weight increased, and her physical condition became a constant struggle. She sometimes needed assistance to move. The Queen, who was expected to appear powerful, was privately struggling simply to stand and walk. But she continued. She attended meetings. She performed ceremonies. And she remained involved in affairs of state. Then another historic event happened. In 1707, England and Scotland were united. The Acts of Union created the Kingdom of Great Britain, and became the first monarch of the new United Kingdom. It was one of the most important political changes of her reign. The Queen had inherited a divided political world. And during her reign, a new Britain was created. But even this historic achievement could not heal the problems inside the palace. Sarah Churchill was becoming increasingly distant. Anne's relationship with Abigail was growing stronger. And Sarah felt betrayed. She believed Abigail had taken her place. She became bitter. And eventually she began criticizing the Queen herself. The friendship that had once seemed unbreakable was collapsing. And had spent years depending on Sarah. But now, she had to make a painful decision. She could forgive Sarah, or she could remove her from her life, and finally chose distance. Sarah lost her position at court, and the woman who had once been the Queen's closest friend was pushed away. For Anne, It was another personal loss. But there was still one person who remained beside her. Prince George. Her husband. Her companion. Her quiet source of comfort. And had lost her children. She had lost friends. She had lost the closeness she once shared with Sarah. But George remained. For a while. And could still believe that perhaps she would not have to face another devastating loss. But history had something else waiting for her. In 1708, Prince George became seriously ill. And was terrified. She had already lost so many people she loved. And now, the man who had stood beside her through years of grief, was becoming dangerously weak. The Queen could do nothing except watch. And once again, and found herself facing the possibility of losing the person she loved most. The crown could not protect her. Power could not save him. And the Queen, who had already buried so many people, was about to experience another heartbreaking goodbye. Prince George had been one of the few constants in Anne's life. He had stayed beside her through years of pregnancy, loss, political pressure, and royal responsibility. But in 1708, his health began to fail. Anne was deeply worried. She had already lost so many children. She had lost her friendship with Sarah Churchill. And now she was terrified that she might lose her husband. Prince George became seriously ill. And remained close to him. She knew that there was nothing a crown could do to stop death. Nothing a palace could do to protect the people she loved. And then, Prince George died. And was devastated. The woman who had already experienced more personal loss than most people could imagine, was now a widow. She had become queen. But the throne felt almost meaningless without the people she loved. And mourned deeply. She wore black. She withdrew from many social activities. And those around her could see how much the loss had affected her. Yet the country still needed its queen. Britain was still involved in war. The government needed leadership. And had to continue performing her duties. Even while her heart was broken. She returned to work. She continued meeting ministers. She continued receiving reports. And she continued appearing in public. This was the pattern of Anne's life. Private grief. Public duty. Again and again. She could never simply stop being queen. But the political situation was changing. The war was becoming expensive. The British people were tired. And political divisions were becoming stronger. And was caught between different groups who wanted Britain to follow different paths. She had to make difficult choices. And those choices created enemies. The woman who had once depended heavily on Sarah Churchill now found herself relying on other advisors. Sarah's influence was gone. Abigail Marsham had become much more important. But even Abigail could not replace what Anne had lost. And had lost her husband. She had lost her children. And she had lost the friendship that had once given her comfort. Her health was also becoming worse. She suffered from severe physical problems. She sometimes struggled to walk. She was often in pain. But she continued working. Then came another political crisis. The government changed. The Whigs and Tories fought for influence. And had to navigate between them. And she became increasingly determined to choose her own ministers. She was no longer the young queen who depended entirely on others. She had learned how dangerous it could be to trust someone completely. The crown had changed her. But the years of grief had also changed her. She had become quieter, more cautious, and more determined to control what remained of her life. Meanwhile, Sarah Churchill continued to speak about Anne. She wrote about their friendship. She described how close they had once been. And she clearly believed that Anne had treated her unfairly. But Anne rarely answered publicly. She did not want to reopen the wounds. The friendship was over. And there was nothing she could do to bring it back. Then Britain finally began moving toward peace. The War of the Spanish Succession was coming to an end. And in 1713, the Treaty of Utrecht was signed. Britain emerged with important gains. The war had been costly, but Anne's government could finally look toward peace. For the Queen. However, there was another problem. The succession. Anne had no surviving children. The future of the crown was no longer a simple family matter. The throne would pass to the Protestant House of Hanover. George of Hanover was now the heir, and knew that another family would eventually take her place. She had spent her entire life surrounded by royal succession. And now, she knew that she would leave the throne without a child of her own. That fact must have been deeply painful. She had wanted children. She had lost them. She had wanted a family. She had lost much of it. She had wanted companionship. And she had lost Prince George. She had wanted lifelong friendship. And she had lost Sarah. And still had the crown. But the crown could not replace everything she had lost. By 1714, her health was failing rapidly. She was only 49 years old. But years of illness and grief had taken a heavy toll. Her body was becoming weaker. Her movements were difficult. And the Queen, who had once carried the weight of a nation, was now struggling simply to survive. Her final days were approaching. And soon, Britain would have to say goodbye to another queen. The woman who had lost almost everything was preparing to face her final moment. And when Anne died, the crown would pass to a man she had never met, George of Hanover. A new royal dynasty would begin. And the story of Queen Anne, the queen who had spent her life searching for happiness, would come to its heartbreaking end. By the beginning of 1714, Queen Anne's health had become very poor. She was only 49 years old. But years of illness, pregnancy, grief, and political pressure had taken a terrible toll on her body. And struggled to walk. She often suffered from severe pain. And those around her could see that the Queen was becoming weaker. Yet even during the final months of her life, she remained concerned about Britain. She had spent years carrying the responsibilities of the crown. And she knew that the future of the country depended on a peaceful succession. And had no surviving children. This was perhaps the deepest sadness of her life. She had wanted to be a mother. She had wanted her children to survive. She had wanted to see them grow into adults. But one by one, they had been taken from her. The child she had hoped would survive, Prince William, had died at only 11 years old. And after his death, Anne never had another surviving child. Her husband Prince George had also died. The man who had stood beside her through years of tragedy was gone. Sarah Churchill, once her closest friend, was also no longer part of her inner circle, and had lost almost everyone who had once been important to her. And yet, she continued to carry the crown. In her final years, Anne became increasingly isolated. She spent more time at her royal residences. Her health made public appearances difficult. But Britain still watched her. She was still queen. Still the symbol of the monarchy. Still the person whose signature and decisions mattered. Her reign had changed Britain in important ways. During her time on the throne, England and Scotland were united into the Kingdom of Great Britain. Britain became more powerful internationally. The country experienced major military victories. And the foundations of a new political era were created. But Anne's greatest legacy was perhaps something more personal. She showed that a monarch could experience enormous private suffering, while still carrying out public duty. She did not have the easy life people sometimes imagine when they hear the word queen. Her palaces could not protect her from grief. Her wealth could not protect her from illness. And her crown could not protect the people she loved. In July 1714, Anne's condition became extremely serious. Her doctors were deeply concerned. The people around her understood that the end was near, and had spent 49 years on earth, 13 of those years as queen. And now, she was preparing to leave the world she had ruled. On the 1st of August 1714, Queen Anne died at Kensington Palace. She was 49 years old. The Queen who had lost so many people had finally lost her own life. Her death brought the end of the Stuart dynasty. The crown passed to George of Hanover. He became King George I. A new royal family began, and Britain entered another chapter of its history. But Queen Anne's story remained. A story of a woman who had everything a monarch could possess, and yet experienced a lifetime of personal tragedy. She had a crown, but she could not keep her children. She had a palace, but she could not escape loneliness. She had power, but she could not stop death. She had friendship, but even that friendship eventually disappeared. She had a husband she loved, and then she had to live without him. Perhaps that is what makes Anne's story so powerful. Because behind the royal portraits, behind the ceremonies, behind the crown, there was simply a woman who wanted to be loved, who wanted to be a mother, who wanted her family to survive, and who wanted a little happiness. But history gave her something very different. It gave her a crown, and with that crown came responsibility, war, political conflict, illness, and unimaginable loss. Queen Anne's life reminds us that a palace does not always mean happiness, and a crown does not always mean a life without pain. Sometimes, the person sitting on the throne can be the loneliest person in the room. Anne became queen. She ruled Britain. She helped shape a new kingdom, and she left behind a place in British history. But her greatest story was not about power. It was about endurance. She lost her children. She lost her husband. She lost her closest friendship. She lost much of her health. And eventually, she lost her life. But she never stopped carrying the responsibility placed upon her. Queen Anne had worn the crown, but the crown could never heal her heart. And perhaps that is the true story behind the queen who lost almost everything. This was the life of Queen Anne, a woman who had a crown, but paid for it with a lifetime of sacrifice. Visit Sleepless Historian for more British royal history and emotional stories. Good night.